Daryl Ritchie, psychologist here. Circles of relationship. This model was introduced to me, at least, through Terence T. Gorski, if you want to look him up. He was really famous in his work for substance use disorders and recovery. Staying Sober was his first book. But this model I first was exposed to on cassette tape, so you know how long ago it was, with him and a psychologist named Claudia Black. He later included this model in some of his books. I'm going to rely heavily on his model. I'm going to depart from it to some degree, and I'll let you know where that happens as well. So there are different levels of relationship, and those different levels of relationship include different levels of communication. First level would be considered acquaintances. And the communication in this level is superficial. So acquaintances are everybody that might be in your community. And depending on how large the community is in which you live, this could be thousands of people. And obviously the communication would stay superficial because you just don't have time to develop relationships with all those people. The bigger and more crowded the community that you live in, the lower the level of communication there will be. So you may throw your hand up at somebody, or you may not. And the more crowded that becomes, the more people that move into this acquaintance level. You may know that if you live in the city by knowing that you don't know half the neighbors that live around you. The next level inside of that would be considered activity friends. Much smaller group of people. So different activities that you're involved in, like recreational activities, work could be considered an activity like that. So again, depending on the size of your workplace and how many activities you're involved in, this could be 200, 300, 400 people, or as few as a couple of dozen. Church would also fall in that category, for example. Now the communication in this level starts to increase, mostly because of the amount of time that you spend with those people. Now, if you're in a church where you go on Sunday mornings and you walk in right at the time the service starts, you face forward during the whole service, leave as soon as it's over, you may not have any communication more than you do with your acquaintances. But at work and other places, and even in church if you're more involved, you begin to have time, a few minutes here and there, where you begin to talk with people. And in that process, you may reveal something about your family, your interests, and so on. If you're involved in a recreational activity, some of that information is already there because you're involved in an activity with them. The relationship is based primarily on the activity, though. If you stop that activity or take that activity to a different location, it's likely that you won't see those people anymore. Friends. Now this is where things begin to really change, because although you may have communication processes with friends, much like you do with activity friends and acquaintances at times, you will also begin to have other kinds of communication, maybe not frequently, depends on the kind of person that you are. Men a lot of times don't have very intimate communication with each other, where women are much better at that. But there may be times at which you'd have I and you kind of communication. I am so glad you're a part of my life. I don't know what I would do without you. Would be a potential kind of communication you would have in a friend relationship. That's unlikely to have in an activity, and certainly very unlikely to have in an acquaintance. If you were standing at a bus stop waiting for a bus and there was somebody in your community that was standing next to you that you didn't know, and you turned to them and said, I'm so glad you're part of my life, I don't know what I would do without you, they might walk away and miss their bus. So this communication process is much more intimate potentially. The number of people that are in this category also is much smaller because it's hard to maintain that level of communication and intimacy with very many people. Now, some people may have a very broad group of friends if they have lots of exposure to each other, frequent reconnection, lots of intimate communication. But most of us would probably have a handful of people in this area, 5 to 20 probably at most. Inside of that would be close relationship. And this is where I began to depart from Terry Gorski's model. He talks about romantic relationship here, but he holds that pretty loosely, where I put a pretty strict boundary around it. This is your marriage relationship, essentially. Part of the reason that Terry Gorski lessened the boundary around this is because it's the trend in the United States today. This relationship has a much closer level of intimacy. It involves sexual intimacy and communication intimacy that would be reserved just for that relationship. If we don't have those things in that relationship, the marriage relationship or close relationship becomes more like a friendship or less. But it's intended to have that level of intimacy, and I'll try to do another video on a triangular theory of love, which will help us to better understand that. But for now, we would say that that's a preserved relationship. It requires a submission of your will, and mutually so in the relationship, in order to make it work. And we've seen an increasing number of people who are unwilling to do that in the United States, such that the number of single households in the United States is increasing, for other reasons as well, I'm sure, financial reasons being an example. But that inability to surrender your will to another person is a primary reason that 25% or more of the people in the United States live alone, but not in partnership, and that 50% of the people in the United States don't live in a committed marriage. And among those that do get married, the divorce rate is about 50%. So this has been crumbling a lot in terms of maintaining a boundary and maintaining that mutual submission of will. I want to introduce one more relationship. Put it in the very center. It's the bullseye. It's our relationship with God. And a lot of people don't even believe that exists. And so the pattern for these other relationships is going to be based more on self-understanding and self-will. And I think that's part of the problem. Our relationship with God was intended to be right from the beginning. I believe God is a personal being who wants to have a personal relationship with us, and that the Creator knew of our existence before He ever created it at the foundations of the universe. He intended there to be a kind of relationship between us where there was that submission of will. But we, in our brokenness, have been self-willed and pulled ourselves away to the point that we don't even believe God exists because we don't have ears to hear or eyes to see on a spiritual level. Now, I believe that Jesus came to this world in order to restore that relationship and to give us the eyes to see and ears to hear. He totally submitted His will in order to provide an example and also to provide the perfect person to make the bridge between us and God. He was God. He took on human form and gave up everything about Himself that was divine and lived in perfect will, submission of His will, to the point that He could overcome the things that separate us from God and restore that to us. I believe He still lives, and He lives to provide that spirit connection, so that as we look into His face and reflect His image, we begin to have an understanding of what it means to submit our wills to a person who's perfectly in love with us, that we don't need to fear in that way. Now, we need to be in awe of Him because of who He is, but we don't need to fear any rejection from Him because He perfectly loves us. So that's the basic model of relationship. I hope this was helpful to you. I'll try to do other videos on the nature of intimate relationship. If you want to look into this a little bit further, you can look at my website. I'll put a link to that as well. I'd love to be able to communicate with you, so you can find my link to Facebook and make comments there. There's a group tab there called the Dialogue Group. You can make comments in that. You can certainly email me. That contact page is on my website or on my Facebook page. You can always make comments in the YouTube section of comments if you're watching on YouTube. Thanks for watching.